Hello, and thank you for joining us today for this Google Plus Hangout. My name is Megan O'Neill. I'm a digital reporter here at the Chronicle of Philanthropy, and I'm going to serve as your moderator today. We have a great session ahead of us in which we're going to talk about how you can go about writing or otherwise creating an institutional or organizational history, and how that history can be used to further your mission, either internally or externally. We have two experts joining us to share their advice. But before I introduce them, I want to do a few housekeeping items. First, you have a few ways to answer questions today. We've turned on the Q&A for the Hangout if you're watching on YouTube or Google+. And if you're watching this on our website, philanthropy.com, you can simply comment in the chat box that you're going to see at the bottom of the page. It says Chronicle Live Discussion at the top, so you can type in your questions there. And if you're interested in reviewing a recording of the discussion, it will be immediately available on this page, as well as on the Chronicle's Google Plus and YouTube pages. So if you want to refer to this at some point in the future or share it with colleagues, you certainly will have the chance to do that. Now, to introduce our guests, we have Pete Bird. He's the president and chief executive of the Frist Foundation. It's a family foundation based down in Nashville. He's been there since the inception of the foundation as a corporate foundation, I believe in 1983. He penned the organization's first history in the early 1990s, and he actually now rewrites it just about every year. We also have Jessica Elfenbein. She's a historian and a senior associate dean at the graduate school at the University of South Carolina. She's written extensively about the philanthropic and nonprofit space, including books on the YMCA of Baltimore and the Washington, D.C. Board of Trade. She also played a role in bringing back to life the archives of a number of nonprofits, foundations, and civic organizations in Baltimore. It was a long-running project there. And she's going to share a little bit about that with us today. So to get started, Peter, I was hoping to start with you.
Sure.
As I mentioned, you are the original author of the Frist Foundation's history, but it's something that you didn't get going until a number of years into the organization's existence. So can you narrate for us the backstory there? Was there a specific event or aha moment that prompted you to get started on this? What was sort of the catalyst for creating this history, and then how did you get started on it?
Absolutely. And first of all, thank you, Megan, for inviting me to be a part of this conversation. And I love being called an expert, even though I'm just a guest. But here's what happened with our foundation. Started as a corporate foundation. We were part of Hospital Corporation of America, and actually started in 1983. The company was well along, but the foundation was brand new, and I was part of the initial staff of the foundation. And like most initial staffs, we ran around and did our thing and put things together and researched and built and made grants. And about 9 years into the foundation's history, we ended up with a new CEO who came in, and the first thing he asked was, tell me about the history of the foundation. And so I proceeded to tell him, since I was there from day one, everything I knew about the history, who's who and what's what. And he said, you know what? You could write this down and you wouldn't even have to have this conversation with me. We could just improve on the conversation because I would have the history and so would everybody else. And I said, you've got a great idea. And so the first history of our foundation was born. And so it was, we were 10 years old at that point. And it's amazing how much history can happen in 10 years.
And you relied largely on your own memory to do this? Did you look through old reports, or?
Well, the nice thing is we had all the annual reports from our foundation. We also had all our board books. We had our I remembered who our staff was and who our initial board was. And so a lot of these things could be done from memory because they had not changed. But when you start changing things, and I mean moving offices or changing boards of directors or changing staff or changing focus, the more you change, the tougher it is to rely on a human being, a walking institutional memory, which is what I was. And the more you need to write it down.
How long was that first draft?
That first draft was about 6 pages long.
Oh, so that's pretty long.
And our current draft, which is 11 pages long, is about 5,000 words.
Okay.
And it gives a really good picture of where we came from and where we've been.
So the length of a nice New Yorker article or something.
Absolutely.
Great. Jessica, does every organization need a history? And of course, many of our audience members are probably working at places that don't have the benefit of that the First House Foundation has in a character like Pete, who's been there forever and has lived the history. So in that case, what sorts of materials should people be drawing on? You've done this type of work. You've done the digging and the research. You know, what are some great sources of materials, and where should people go looking?
Well, Pete named some of the categories. You want to look at annual reports. You want to look at committee reports. You want to look at correspondence if it exists. You certainly want to look at your founding documents. You want to look at your bylaws, your mission statement, your vision statement, all the things that should be helping you to do the work you do day to day. I'm an academic historian, so my introduction to organizational and institutional histories was actually while I was looking for a dissertation topic, and I knew I wanted to do an urban history, and I thought it would be, I was very interested in the intersection of religious and philanthropic history in an urban setting, and that led me to the YMCA, and I thought it would be very interesting to use the YMCA's records as a lens on the urban history of a particular place. So my take was different. I wasn't coming from the organization, but in time I partnered with the organization. And I think, of course, it's very important that the organizations hold on to their founding documents minimally, but they should also be keeping the critical documents from each year of operation.
I have a suggestion, too, about that, something that Jessica didn't mention, but that I've found helpful, not just in our history, but in any history, is there is a website called archive.org, and what it does is over time it snapshots of websites as they existed 3, 5, 10 years ago. And increasingly, people can't reach into drawers, dust off annual reports to get history. Mm-hmm. So much history now is kept electronically. And archive.org is a great reference to see what were we telling the public that we were back in 1999. Mm-hmm. So that's just a thought, too.
Good idea.
Both of you have mentioned board reports and maybe founding documents. Why are board reports and founding documents sufficient? I mean, is an organizational history different? Is it, and if so, how, and why do you need one?
Well, I would argue that that's probably not sufficient, but it's a place you begin. I mean, I think that the official records of the organization are a great way to begin, but I would also look for contextual information coming from other sources, from media, from anyone else who's observing. If you're a nonprofit being funded by somebody else, then the funding records would be very important, maybe in telling the story. I mean, it kind of depends what the goal of telling the story is as well.
Jessica has a great point about it's a great place to start. Sometimes, for many organizations, it's the only place. Unfortunately, we who are busy staff people don't have a lot of time to write things down as we go along. We only produce documents, strategic plans, reports on grants when we're forced to. And often that comes in the discipline of an annual report or maybe a quarterly board meeting. And if you do your meetings well and keep your minutes well, you'll have a good record.
Now, the two of you, Pete, you've written or created an organizational history internally. Jessica, you've done this as an external player, so talk to me about the difference there. I mean, should it be done by an internal staff member if their bandwidth exists? Should an outside professional writer be commissioned to do this work? What's sort of the decision-making process there? What would you guys recommend?
Again, I think it depends on what the organization's goals are in having the work done. If it's to keep sort of a roster of who's been there and there's somebody on staff who's able to do that, then I think that might be adequate. If the goal is to try to figure out contributions in a broader context, then having the services of a professional historian might be very beneficial. It sort of depends on what the goal is. I guess as an academic historian, I've long thought that historians are not like accountants. You don't think to yourself, oh, I must bring a historian to the table. We wouldn't think about doing our accounting without an accountant, but we often think about doing our histories without a historian. I would say that there's a value add in bringing a historian to the party if you're able to, and oftentimes that means reaching out to a local university and finding either an advanced undergraduate or a graduate student who might work with you. I mean, I think if an agency is able to do it, the value add can be enormous. But I certainly understand that it's often not the case, that it's something that's readily or easily done.
So you think a local university history department is maybe a good place to go mining for a collaborator or partner?
I would. It could even be done with the class. I know that in my teaching experience, I've done this work in partnership with organizations. So in Baltimore, for example, a grassroots organization called the Citizens Planning and Housing Association, which had been founded in 1941 and has been doing fair housing ever since, we collaborated with them on the occasion of their 60th anniversary. Anniversaries provide wonderful moments for these kinds of collaborative projects between universities and nonprofits or foundations. But again, it's not the only way. It's a way. It's not the only way to get the work done.
If that were to be the route that you took, would there be any concern about, I don't know, quality control or the investment of your writing partner, or how do you go about maybe vetting somebody like that?
Well, I think the agency needs to. You're not going to turn it over to students without having vetted the students, just as you wouldn't hire an employee without vetting the employee. So I think the same steps would be in place. I also think there are issues of confidentiality depending on the nature of the work that's being done by the organization and up to how recently you care to do the history. So in a very young organization, you can go back 10 years, but you might not want, there may be things there that are sensitive or confidential, and you'd have to be very careful. I know that the archives I'm most familiar with are the University of Baltimore archives, and there they have the records of more than 100 civic, voluntary, and nonprofit organizations. Most of them are wide open and available for the public to use. There are some where they involve records of individuals or very sensitive topics that get closed for a period of time. So the most recent 15 years or 25 years might not be available. It depends. I would say, though, in partnering with the university, you do want a backstop. You do want the faculty member to be ultimately your partner in this. The class can do the work, but somebody's going to have to take responsibility for quality control, and it needs to be a partnership.
So I want to expand a little bit on this theme of sensitive or confidential material. And, you know, not every organization has the skeletons in the closet, but some do. And it could be something as simple as a grant that didn't go so great, or an executive who lasted 8 weeks or something. How do you go about managing what maybe could be little dark spots in a history? Do you address them head on? Do you leave them out? How do you sort of be honest but still accomplish the mission or the goal?
Well, yeah, go ahead, Pete.
Go ahead. I think you start out every document. By the way, I'm a former journalist, so I'm used to writing and putting together things, but not histories. And but I think you start out every document saying this will be an internal document, and that takes off a lot of the pressure, and you write the truth. And you gather the truth as you see it. And then you have to gather around the table and say, do we like the truth as we see it? And how much of this truth do we want to expose? And a lot of times, I think you have to distinguish between very old history and newer history. It's fascinating. We're talking about philanthropy here, and the vast majority of foundations were founded and established in the last 35 or 40 years. There's some glorious historic foundations, Cleveland, Duke, the
Rockefeller.
Pew, that
Yeah.
have been around for many decades more. But the fascinating thing is a lot of this history is newer history. But I think it's a two-stage process. Jessica, you wanted to add?
Yeah, well, I think one of the interesting things is, in an ideal world, you would have foundation records and nonprofit and voluntary organization records all available, because then you get in, you can see the dialogue that existed at the time of the grant making between grants that were applications that were made, grants that were approved, grants that weren't approved, long-term success. I mean, it's very interesting when you can see the dialogue, but that's a fairly rare. I mean, that requires putting archival records someplace where there's some access for the public and the ability to have those conversations back and forth. And I think that's pretty rare, in part for the reason that Pete described, which is that the vast majority of foundations are in the second half of the 20th century or more recent. But the community foundations are another great example of that. It would be wonderful to have them in conversation with the local agencies that they have chosen to fund, as well as those they chose not to fund, and to look and see what the developments there look like.
So obviously you don't go about creating an organizational history to have it sit in a dusty drawer somewhere. So I'm curious to ask both of you how you go about using these histories in whatever format they may come, whether it's written or a beautiful electronic digital presentation. I want to hear how these can be used internally with staff, with board members, with trustees, maybe with people who are coming in and people who are leaving, and then externally, if you're able to use them to leverage your mission or communicate your story to your audience, to your constituents. Pete, do you want to start?
Sure. Where our history has come in most handy over the last 30 years has been to orient new board members. And we have had a big changing of the guard in the early 2000s. And those 3 new board members who came in, succeeding 3 board members who rolled off, they were so appreciative to know all that came before them, and it was 20 years worth of history.
And I think you remember you telling me that these were young family members, right? This is a family foundation.
Second generation. We're talking about children of the founders, and the founders are still on the board. But the children, who were in their 40s, really had very little knowledge of and involvement in the foundation. And to have that internal document was extremely valuable. And it's, interestingly enough, you think, oh, for new people it's great. For the rest of the people who have been around a while, they know everything. Fascinating. Every year our chair comes to us and said, you know, it's funny, I read this every year, and some of it sinks in and some of it doesn't. But it's great to be reminded who we are, where we've come from, who was involved in the early years, and what we've learned over time. So it's even a valuable document for those who are living the history as well as those who are contained in the history.
So your rewriting process, you said you try and rewrite or edit every year. Do you set aside 2 or 3 days at the end of your fiscal year to do this? How do you decide what to lose? How do you decide what to include?
For me, and I do revise and update the history every year, and I read it from the very beginning every year, and sometimes even tweak that and add some things that I didn't think were important at the time, but they are important now.
Can you give us an example of something maybe that wasn't in the first copy?
Yes, I'll give you a great example. In the early 1980s, we had a corporate foundation, and the board members were appointed by the corporation. And in 1989, our chairman said, you know, I see all these takeovers going on. Corporations come and go. They can go away. And why don't we adopt a self-perpetuating board that elects each other each year instead of allowing the corporation to do that? And And that happened. And I said, why do you want to do that? And he said, well, if the company goes away, the foundation will stay. And we will have control of our own destiny as a foundation. And darned if 5 years later, the corporation got sold, the headquarters moved out of town, and we blew the dust off the history and reminded ourselves that we had a self-perpetuating board. We didn't have to move. We didn't have to go with the corporation out of town. And we ended up staying in Nashville and spinning off and becoming an independent foundation at that time. And that's because that history reminded us every year of that we had the power and the ability to click our heels together 3 times and say there's no place like home.
Very good. Jessica, I want to spend a couple of minutes with you. I'm hoping you can describe to us this project you worked on at the University of Baltimore. It was an archive collection that included extensive materials from various organizations, civic organizations, nonprofits, and foundations in the Baltimore area. As you described it to me previously, the doors were sort of flung open and all of this history poured forth, and you, along with some colleagues, were able to connect some of these organizations with materials that had been sort of forgotten over the decades. So can you sort of describe to us that project and what the outcome of that was?
Sure. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, a very far-sighted sociologist at the University of Baltimore had reached out to a whole bunch of civic, voluntary, and nonprofit organizations soliciting their archival records. And just as an interesting aside, he did this because he had in mind a concept that presaged the internet in terms of keyword searching. He was doing an urban thesaurus, and he was collecting material to do the urban thesaurus. That's what it was about. And he went after some federal funding, and then in the early 1980s, when federal funding dried up, these collections sat dormant for about 15 years. In the mid-1990s, together with the long-serving archivist at the University of Baltimore, a guy named Tom Holloway, we began looking at the collections that were there, and it was everything from the League of Women Voters and Planned Parenthood to the YMCA and on and on. And there were dozens of organizations. So some of them were local affiliates of national organizations, and others were homegrown grassroots organizations. So it was quite an array of organizations whose records were there. Now, as you might imagine, between the late 1970s and the mid to late 1990s, leadership of most of these organizations had changed. Both volunteer board leadership had changed and paid professional staff had changed. So we undertook a major letter writing campaign saying, do you know the University of Baltimore holds your historical records, and would you be interested in reconnecting with the records that are there? And so we reached out, and the response rate from those organizations that continued to be extant was about 80% or better. And a whole bunch of those organizations said, wow, this is so cool. We had no idea we had founding materials. We had no idea where our materials were. Can we come and visit with our materials? Can we hold a board meeting in your space so that our leadership can see, kind of what we were when we started and where we've come from? And over the course of years, I think we held dozens of meetings of the boards of various of these organizations in the archives at the University of Baltimore. And one of the things that was interesting is that material had been sitting there dormant for a long time. And the question came up, just the care and tending of that material has a certain cost to it. It's not a great cost, but there is a cost to it. You want stuff that's old and paper. To Pete's point, not everything's in paper, but the stuff that we did have that was in paper should be kept in acid-free folders in an ideal world, because you want to preserve it for the long term if you don't digitize it and do other things with it. And even if you do, you might want to do that. And this was before the major digitization movement had begun. So we reached out and we asked whether the organizations whose records we held would be interested in supporting their own organization's records. And we were a public institution, and there had to be a way to triage what we had so that they could get processed so they'd have the greatest use, whether that ultimately meant to digitize those records, which is what we in fact did. But how do you order them? We had so many collections, we'd be going for years and years and years on the digitization because we had limited staff, as every place has. So again, very interestingly, most groups and organizations whose records were there stepped up and said yes, they were willing to pay a minimal amount each year for the care and tending of their historical records. And that offset the cost of having a project archivist whose job it was to digitize these records and put them online and make them accessible to the broadest public, again with the caveat that sensitive records could be closed for some period of time. And that's what happened at the University of Baltimore in their archives, and I think it's a really interesting outcome. And there's been more active collecting there. Most recently, they ran out of space, and then the question was what to do next. Of course, digitization offers some answers. But it does help organizations, and again, I can speak to the YMCA of Central Maryland had its records, and they go back to 1853. I mean, they're an old organization. They were keeping their founding documents in paid space, in an Iron Mountain equivalent. Actually, it was Iron Mountain. They were paying for top-of-the-line storage space there, and in time they moved all of their oldest and original historical materials to the university's archives, where they're being well kept, and the expense for them is less.
You had sort of described to me how some of these organizations went about using or making use of some of this material that had suddenly turned up. Can you sort of describe to me how that went about? Maybe some interesting examples, reconnecting with past staff members, past donors, any great stories or anecdotes that you think maybe some of our audience could borrow from?
Yeah, I think both in terms of friend and fundraising, I can think of two very specific examples, both tied to anniversaries, and that's another sort of piece of this. I think oftentimes organizational histories get done at a 10th or a 25th or a 100th or a sesquicentennial if an organization's been around that long. So in the first instance, I worked very closely with the YMCA when it did its, now just the Y of Central Maryland, when it did its 150th, well, first it's 140th and then it's 150th, and they were able to use their historical materials, I think, to really good effect for both fund and friend raising. An equally powerful example was a local organization called the Citizens Planning and Housing Association, which partnered with the university to use its records at the time of its 60th anniversary. And there were still people alive who were founders of that organization 60 years previously, but because of changes in conditions and people's changing interests, there were none of the founding members were currently involved with the organization. And through their historical work and archival work, they were able to bring back into the fold people who had been there at the inception of the organization. And I think it was a terrifically powerful both friend and fundraiser for CPHA. And it was fascinating to watch. They organized by decade. They had reunion parties of people who had been active in the 40s, people who had been active in the 50s, people who had been active in the 60s, and moving up to current times. And there was huge interest, and people were very, very pleased to be able to be reunited with people who represented a particular moment in their growth and in the organization's growth and development.
So fundraising by decade.
Yeah, exactly.
It was a success.
Exactly.
Terrific. All right, I want to pose sort of a fun question to both of you, and I'm going to limit you to 30 seconds each because we got a couple of audience questions too, and I want to move through them here before we wrap up. In the years that you've been doing research and historical writing, any gems that you've come across, any nuggets of history that you just loved that come to mind that you'll never forget? Pete, I'd like to start with you.
Well, there's been nothing that jumped out and surprised me, because if you've lived the history, both organizationally and institutionally, writing it down is more memories than anything else. But what's interesting to think about is, at a family foundation like this, is fast forwarding and thinking what it would be like 20 or 30 years from now to open up this history and realize we weren't always a family foundation. We started out as a corporate foundation, and that we were not kidnapped and taken to another city when there was a corporate takeover, but we actually spun out and became an independent foundation. They'd be interested in very large institutions, such as the Community Foundation of Middle Tennessee, really started in our boardroom. And so this is stuff we know, but I think another generation or a generation of grandchildren from this generation may not know at all. So I think there are surprises that are happening right now that are going to really surprise a future generation.
Okay. Jessica, anything in those archives at the University of Baltimore that any amazing photos or, I don't know, old books, anything that was fun?
Yeah, all kinds of fun things. I mean, maybe I probably know the YMCA collection, which is a very big and very strong collection there, best. And one of the things that's sort of fun to think about there is the YMCA started as the Young Men's Christian Association. It's no longer young, it's no longer male, and it's no longer Christian, and it still serves a really important function in the community. So, you know, kind of the flexible vessel approach, that's totally interesting. And having said that it isn't what it used to be, there are some connections that are really fun. I found lots of information about ties between the YMCA and the Women's Christian Temperance Union in the mid-19th century, and movement for men to economize. There was a thought that sperm production for healthy children would be better if you didn't masturbate, right? So that came up then. And really, really great stuff about men should wear pants that don't have side pockets. And so there were some fashion statements in the material that was there. But on a more serious note, the idea that they didn't use language like egalitarian parenting, but it was part of what they were talking about. They wanted to remove a double standard in the mid-19th century in terms of men and women and how they conducted themselves on an interpersonal basis and in terms of sexual mores and that sort of thing, which was really quite progressive. And if you fast forward that to to 2014 and the YMCA's emphasis on healthy families and responsible parenting, it's not so far off. So it's very interesting to sort of see the connections and the disconnections as well.
Okay. I have two audience questions, and I'm going to actually adjust these both to Pete because I think he's the most appropriate respondent for them both. And Pete, we're already 2 minutes over here, so I'm going to really hold you to that 30-second limit.
Okay.
The first one is, when a founder passes away or moves on from a foundation, what's the best way to strike a balance between honoring that legacy and communicating the foundation's new vision? And this question comes from Bridget Kulik.
Well, what comes into play here is, in many times, a founder's wishes, and those can be legal documents in the form of a will or estate, or it can be just expressions of interest and personality over the years. You ought to try and capture that in a history, and I think by capturing history accurately, which includes vision of an organization, you are honoring the founder.
Okay. The second question, it comes from Mason Rummel, and he's asking, have you ever considered doing an oral history with your founder? And do you think comments in the founder's words would be valuable to future generations as they're sort of charged with steering this organization?
Absolutely. And we have not done that, but it's a great idea, and I think it's often hard to pin down a founder and get them to talk about that, but that is a great idea.
Okay, terrific. I have to wrap it up there, guys. We're a couple of minutes over already, but many, many thanks to Pete and Jessica. You've been excellent, excellent guests. This is a topic that we will probably be revisiting, writing about again in the future. Again, if you'd like to review today's conversation, it's immediately available on Google Plus and YouTube, as well as on our website, philanthropy.com. And we regularly host these type of online forums around various themes. I'm planning one in about 2 weeks on sort of the intersection of Bitcoin and nonprofit. So if that's a topic that interests you, I hope our viewers will return to us. So again, thank you very much, and I hope that you all have a very lovely day.
Thank you, Megan.